Welcome to the New Liar podcast, everybody. My name is David Goslin. I'm the editor of the Chained Muse poetry website, as well as the New Liar magazine. So I have here with us a new special guest, Pascal Chevrier. Welcome, Pascal.
Nice. Thank you, Dave, for inviting me.
So Pascal is a history teacher based in Quebec, and he has a lot of ideas about history. He's thought a lot about it, and we thought we'd bring him on because, especially today, there are all sorts of debates about history, right? The history of the human species, as well as its history, its future, right? When we're talking about its history, often the next question is, well, what is its future based on its past? And we have all sorts of different ideological struggles that have to do with this question of humanity's past, as well as the past of different nations, different civilizations. And we have Pascal here who's going to help us work through some of these questions and explore a few of the big questions that perhaps go beyond the way that we're often used to thinking about history in terms of, history class in, secondary school or history class in college or university, and where there are a lot of very convenient and often very incomplete narratives and ideas about what human history is. So I want to welcome you to the podcast, Pascal. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Dave. As I said, it's really nice to be with you, and I'm looking forward for this on this discussion.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's many different ways that we could approach this question, right? We decided to talk about history because we both think it's important. And being the New Liar is a podcast, not only a podcast, but a journal of high art, which will be coming out very soon. And we're going to have a lot of different discussions about history, art, the nature of ideas of poetic expression, what it means to express a poetical idea, what it means to think musically. So I think that it's important to consider the question of art when we're talking about history, that a lot of the greatest insights into history can be drawn from timeless art, from great classical art, from however you wish to call it, from art that says something which is something about something which is immutable, that's able to express something that transcends the given place and time in which it was conceived, and says something more, we could say, general or more transcendental about the nature of not only the human species, but about the nature of the universe. And I think this is important, regardless of whether, regardless of what kind of poetry we're reading or what kind of art we are looking at. The question, in one way or another, is really, what universe are we in? When human beings are creating art, when a great poet is expressing some kind of great poetical idea, they're really giving us a sense of the universe in which they are acting in, the universe which they are struggling to comprehend. And I think a lot of the greatest poetry comes from that struggle and sort of working through the paradoxes and the ironies that are inherent in our condition as human beings, which are not just flesh or material, but are also immaterial. And how do we resolve this finite and infinite nature, that which is both finite and infinite, found in what we call human beings, who have a mind, which is the mind is by its nature immaterial. It has no directly perceivable characteristics. But as we've been saying, just because something doesn't have any directly perceivable characteristics, it doesn't mean it doesn't have any indirectly perceivable characteristics.
Hmm.
And the question really becomes, well, not whether they exist or not, but how do we talk about these kind of things?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so I think when it comes, this is where poetry really comes in, because poetry is not literal. Great art is not literal. It's not talking about, it's not simply a question of what you can touch, taste, hear, see, or smell, but it's really how the great artist is using these things to convey something that lies outside of that domain altogether.
Hmm.
Now, as usual, I've gone on for a while, but I think it's important to sort of situate that when we're talking about great art and its role in history, right? It's important to get a sense of, well, how is this art really shaping our understanding of the human species and of our understanding of the universe?
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree with you, Dave.
And
It's
so we want to talk about Prometheus today, don't we, Pascal?
Well, I thought that was that it is a story. It's not just was, as you said, but it's still present with us, and I think it's something that people should go back and reread. Well, actually take, have a more direct relationship with Prometheus, because I think it's really very, very valuable today as we're seeing like the different crises around us. May they be political, cultural, everything that's surrounding us right now, um, basically begs us the question of what is human's nature? What is man's nature in all of this? What are we doing this for?
Right.
Um, and and so I think it's good to go back and see Prometheus and also look forward and think, what is he giving us? What does that story tells us about the future we should have?
Okay, well, let me just ask you, who was Prometheus, Pascal?
Well, that's the first good question. uh, Prometheus, um, basically, if you look at what Aeschylus wrote in his play Prometheus Bound, you see a character of Prometheus, which is not exactly a god like Zeus
Hmm.
and the gods of Olympus, of Mount Olympus, but he's from a former generation, and basically the story is that he sees mankind as a very feeble species compared to all of the other animals,
Mm.
and but he has a love for mankind that will get him to steal fire from Zeus, from the gods of Olympus, and he's going to give fire to mankind in order so that mankind can actually survive and protect itself and expand and become really human and not just another beast.
Right. Hmm. I mean, this is from a long time ago, in a sense. This story is an old story.
Hmm. Yeah, it is,
We have a
but
lot of problems today. So why are you talking to me about this old story?
what, like, before what I said, the idea of what is mankind, and fire, like you said, poetry and high art doesn't just like give you everything. It's not like ready made, you just for your consumption and take it and go home and have fun.
Hmm.
It's really it's made so that it generates something in your mind, and with paradoxes, with irony, and brings you to a discovery of what you are really, which is something that uh, should be experienced as young as possible. But
Hmm.
it's this idea of creativity,
Hmm.
because we're talking about fire, but when you read Aeschylus, uh, there's the when Prometheus speaks, he doesn't just speak about fire. He speaks about the different qualities that mankind needs to be able to create, uh, to invent different ways, better ways of living. And so this is like a God-given tool. Creativity is a God-given tool for mankind. It's man's own.
Mm,
Uh, and that's, how I think it's very relevant today, because what is creativity today? What do people think about, you know, creativity when they hear creativity?
right.
What does that mean?
Netflix, Amazon. I mean, that's what I think. Not, I think
Uh,
things, but that's all the movies, right? All the, I mean, cinema, and I mean, especially under the current, world situation, a lot of people are watching a lot of movies. So there's a lot of, cinematic art, and it plays a really big role. And I mean, cinematic art also has to do with writing, right? Storytelling.
yeah.
So, I mean,
Hmm.
people are very exposed to that, right? I'd say when it comes to creativity and art, that's
Well, yeah, yeah.
lots
But
of
like you go home and you watch Netflix, and the world hasn't changed really, and you can do that many days in a row, and what happens?
right.
People forget that Prometheus is stealing the fire, but who is it stealing the fire from?
Hmm.
And that's where Zeus, is the king of the gods basically, and he doesn't want mankind to have fire. He actually, I think, uh, if I remember well, he wants to destroy mankind at the beginning of the play, and that's where Prometheus says, "Well, no, this is not going to happen. I'm going to prevent that. I'm going to save mankind from Zeus." So as you said, well, the art is about metaphor, irony is about basically revealing reality, but without necessarily saying in a literal way.
Right. Which will always be much more inadequate than if we can find a higher sort of, or always find inadequate expression until we can find some way, some kind of great artistic expression that can sort of give voice to that. And I
Hmm.
mean, I think this question of, yeah, fire. Obviously, it's not literal fire, right? Prometheus stole something from the gods, this thing called fire for now, and
Yeah.
there was Zeus, who again, Prometheus had to steal it. So I
Hmm.
think that's very interesting, and I mean, it it begs a lot of questions because basically Zeus is the arc in Aeschylus's treatment of Prometheus Bound. Zeus is like an archetypal oligarchical figure, right?
Hmm.
Talking
Yeah.
about stealing fire, it's really stealing fire from this kind of oligarchical class, which sort of scorns the human race, right? Humans are disposable, are sort of worthless and petty. Like, why save them, right?
Hmm.
And I think, especially today, I mean, uh, especially today, there is a lot of pessimism about the nature of human beings, right? Are human beings really just a scourge on the earth, right? Are human beings really any different than animals, or are they worse, right? That's often the theme. It's at least, at best, we're equal and should all live in a sort of, equilibrium with nature, and man is just, human beings are just another part of that equilibrium. Or
Hmm.
at worst, the presence of human beings on the planet is destructive and it has to be limited at all costs and with increasingly more drastic means, right? We're seeing a lot of this. So I think this question of Prometheus versus Zeus, it begs some really fundamental questions, like you said, about really what is the nature of human beings and what is this thing called creativity? Everybody's
Hmm.
talking about it, right? But everybody has a different, there are so many different ideas about creativity. And I think
Hmm.
you put this, you made this point before, and maybe you can elaborate, but you made the point that in the same way that human beings were viewed by Zeus, by this oligarchical sort of system, I guess you could say, a Zeusian system, right? He's not Zeus and his friends as this petty thing. And most of the animals, in a sense, human beings are relatively weak and unable to survive in quote unquote nature compared to most animals, right? Most animals sort of they just do it. They don't even really have to think about it, right? It's kind of built in. So you made the point that human beings are really the only creatures that we know of that really rely on their own understanding of the universe to get by. That's really the basis of a human being, of a human civilization. It really depends on its knowledge of the universe around it and knowledge of itself, the way it works. And in a sense, the way it works, or the way the human mind works, the way the human species really functions at the level of mind, is really a reflection of the way the universe functions, such that
Yeah.
by understanding things outside us or within us, we're able to understand that outside or within us, right?
Hmm. Yeah, and today you have people are trying to compartmentalize, or put in different squares, in boxes, what they think is going on, and so they oppose different viewpoints. You know, uh, Basically, like, oh, okay, so what is the best utopia? Is it communism, or is it capitalism?
Right.
What the two, and you always have these opposition. So we could pose a question as, maybe was Prometheus a communist, or was he a capitalist? Which box does he fit in?
Right.
And before we go on with this, well, we'll come back to it. But I wanted to offer you, since we're on a high art, or poetry podcast that you're starting there, I wanted to offer you a poem.
Sure.
Uh, I'm not a poet
How nice.
myself.
You're the first guest to offer a poem. How nice.
Okay, great. Well, I was looking at this, and I wanted to also situate, since we're talking about Greek mythology, I wanted to take a historical precedent which happened in ancient Greece.
Hmm.
And I was looking at Solon of Athens, who became the ruler of Athens in the 7th century before Christ.
Okay.
And he wrote what is known as the constitutional order. I'm going to read you a translation by David Shaven. So sorry, English is not my first language. I'll try to do my best.
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, so I'll try not to butcher this. So, the constitutional order by Solon of Athens. Never will our city be destroyed by Zeus's decree, nor by the will of the blessed immortal gods. For, born of a potent father, great-hearted guardian Pallas Athena spreads her hands o'er our city. But, by money seduced, the Athenians themselves seek mindlessly to corrupt the great city, joined by the iniquitous schemes of their leaders, who from arrogance great woes shall suffer. For they understand not how to restrain gluttony, nor best to order their feasting in quiet. Then the Greek manuscript breaks. It speaks of corrupt ones becoming rich.
Hmm.
It continues, sparing neither sacred ground nor public goods, greedily they steal from the one place or the other. They fail to protect the reverent temples of justice. She who notes silently the what is and what has been, who in time shall come exacting retribution. Behold, an inexorable harm visits all Athens. To vile slavery is she swiftly progressed, which rouses up from slumber civil strife and war, war that wipes out for many their cherished youth. Now our much loved city is soon worn down by faction, while the wicked steer them to confrontations. These evils ensnare the whole people, But the poor, many of them, depart to a foreign land, plundered and bound up in shameful fetters. For the slave's yoke bears all other wickedness. Thus does the public evil come home to each of us. Straining the courtyard gates no longer hold fast. The evil leaps over the high walls. It finds everyone, even him fleeing to the inmost chamber. This my soul commands me teach the Athenians. A bad constitution brings civic turmoil, but a good one shows well ordering and coherence, as it puts shackles round about wrongdoing. It smooths out the rough, it checks greed, tempers hubris, and withers the fruits of reckless impulse. It takes crooked judgments and makes them straight, softens arrogant deeds, halts seditious acts, and ends the bile of grievous strife. And so under it, everything for mankind becomes whole and wise.
Hmm.
That's it.
Wow, that's really something. That's
Yeah, and Solon at the time he took power in Athens, there was a problem because people um, before then were could become slaves if they through debt. So the burden the Solon came in and he basically put a law that was shaking off the burden, all of these debts that people had acquired, and basically the law was meant to reconcile the have and the have not, to figure out a way that to create a society that would progress and where man would be able to uh, not just survive, but really develop their own potential. Everyone of them, not just the rich.
yeah,
So I think it's a very interesting concept for today. What's happening because a lot of people are discussing this. Uh, where is wealth today? Who
right. How are
creates
we
wealth?
discussing it?
Well, when I was reading the poem, I was thinking about this question of yeah, capitalism and what would be the best system for mankind, and a lot of people are saying well we need to break up society. Things are too big. We have to go to smaller. We have to think on a local scale and forget about the greater scheme or globalization as it's known today.
Hmm.
And I think it's very interesting, but I don't think that's a solution.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of paradoxes there, yeah, in terms of, well, I mean that it becomes a whole question of how big should it be? Big, small? Should we think small? Should we think big? Big government is bad. Smaller is usually better. You hear all these different narratives. Local, go local, never mind international. And I mean, it breaks down into all these different sort of schools of thought. But I think, as you stated in the beginning, before we get into any of that, we have to be clear on what the nature of the human species is, because that's what's going to define how we act in the universe. And I mean, there's all sorts of questions, even, a lot of people are just talking about the fact that the earth is finite and it has finite resources, right? We have a very a Malthusian outlook. The Malthusian outlook is very popular today, right? Which just basically states
Hmm.
that resources, we sort of produce linearly resources are consumed exponentially, or sorry,
Well,
human population grows exponentially.
exactly. Yeah.
We can really only produce in a relative
Arithmetically. Yeah. In
arithmetically.
linear way.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, I mean, that's just adopted. But again, there are so many questions there. If we really get back to a more basic question of, well, what is the nature of human creativity? I mean, a lot of the oceans are just as inhabitable or as unknown as, let's say, like near space. There's so much we don't know about our own oceans, right? The Arctic is largely uninhabitable, right? Deserts are in a great part uninhabitable. And if we go back, of course, there's always people who figure out different ways, but the point in terms of organizing, establishing an organized civilization, right, which has, like, Solon is laying out a constitution because he wants to do certain things. And so there are all these different things that need to be taken into account. There are things that need to be measured. There are vices that need to be curbed, right? There are all sorts of different things. But the reality is that a lot of what we consider resources today, if we're just talking about this question of, what is the place of human beings in the universe, in terms of how it's often talked about today, in terms of this Malthusian sort of finite world, finite resources, well, we should ask the question, is creativity finite? We weren't able to live in most of the places that we live now. Most of these places would be uninhabitable for any sort of, for most any kind of large developed civilization. You need infrastructure, right? You need water management. You need these things on an adequate scale to support more than just limited forms of farming, existence, etc. And so, but the whole question is creativity finite? People keep talking about finite resources, but really, what resources do we have that weren't, in a sense, created, that weren't really the result of us gaining a certain amount of knowledge over the universe? Whether it's steel, whether it's pharmaceuticals, whether it's most healthcare. If you just think about the basic infrastructure for healthcare, if you think about the basic technology needed for healthcare, I mean, a lot of this stuff comes from space, quite literally, from the
Yeah,
space
that's
program,
right.
in terms of telecommunications, monitors, sensors, all these things. So I feel like when we're talking about such a rich piece of art as Prometheus, Prometheus Bound, Aeschylus's Prometheus, and just the overall idea, I mean, it's very humbling. And you see that a lot of people have a lot of different ideas, but if you don't start with first principles, right? If you don't start with certain fundamentals, like, well, is creativity finite or not? I mean, you're saying these resources are finite, but what about the resources we haven't created yet?
Yeah, and I wanted to bring you back before, because I want to get into that question of the resources and creativity. But like in the opening sentence, Solon says that never will our city be destroyed by Zeus's decree, nor by the will of the blessed immortal gods. So if you actually counterpose that, it's a very interesting counterposition to the story of Prometheus. He says it's not going to happen from Zeus's decree. And then he goes about attacking the leadership, those that were in power of Athens before he came to rule it. And it's very interesting. And I was thinking also uh, in William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, you probably remember that. It's Act 1, Scene 2.
Mm-hmm.
Cassius says to Brutus, "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings." It's very interesting because, it's the question. The way I see it, there's many ways to see it, I guess, but the way I see it is really like, what are we going to do? What is possible from us to make this place a better place? and doesn't mean that Cassius and Brutus come up with the answer, because well, people should look they should read Julius Caesar to find out how it ends. But I think when you read it, you have to look into what is not said, and the character which is um, very which is not really present, but there's like it's ominous. The fact that he's been talked about, but he's not present, is Cicero.
Mm.
And Cicero knew about Greek history. He knew about, he spoke Greek, and it's said later on in the play, I believe, that he made a speech, but nobody would understood because it was Greek to me.
Yeah, they
So
don't speak Greek.
right, they forgot about what had happened. So the story is going to repeat itself. Basically, there's not going to be any kind of great resolution because they forgot what happened before, and they're going to make similar mistakes. It's never the same, right? Because history never repeats itself, but it takes a different shape, and mistakes happen again and again. And so if you want a better future, it's true, you better know that your past. And in your past, well, there's this story about Prometheus, which I think is very, very valuable for today. So this question of, you were mentioning the resources and creativity. I think these things, these two things are, linked. They're not the same, but they have to be together all the time.
Right. Well, I mean, just going back to the basic idea that you outlined, and I mean, keying off of what's said in that great drama as well, is that human beings are the only species which, we're not like other animals, in that it's not like we have this sort of, uh, you know, guiding instinct that tells us what to do. We don't have claws. We don't run fast like cheetahs. We don't have trunks. We don't have tusks. We don't have large furs. Human beings have creativity. That's really what they have. It's a thing. It's not
Mhm.
it's not just an abstract concept. It's the thing which allows us to actually survive. We survive based on our understanding of the universe, which we can cultivate and express in many different ways, right? And we can cultivate a culture of expressing and investigating that through great art. I think that's largely one of the great roles of art, is to cultivate the creative faculties themselves, to make them uh, more clear, more palpable, more understood, so that they can be applied in all sorts of different ways. And I think if the idea of a Zeus and a Zeusian system is really an oligarchical system, is really that which tries to limit that. And I mean,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Hmm.
we could go in all sorts of different ways. We could say all sorts of different things. But when we
Yeah.
look at education today, when we look at the way people are being taught to think, it's really bad. It has nothing to do with this Promethean outlook. And in fact, it's very popular today. I would
Hmm.
say that a lot of people have a problem with fire, you know, and I think we spoke earlier. You were talking about basically Zeus's policy is make fire look bad.
Hmm. Yeah,
And
exactly.
so today, what are
And
people supposed to aspire to? It's not really fire. I mean, fire's bad. Fire's dangerous. Look at what happens when all these people have knowledge of fire. It's actually, I mean, if you're Zeus, let's say, thought experiment here. If
mhm.
you're Zeus or Zeus's friends, and you run a Zeusian oligarchical system, which Solon identifies. I mean, this is hundreds of years before Aeschylus wrote his play. And I mean, the whole idea of the slave system, right, of debt slavery, like we see this today. This isn't new. I mean, this isn't
Exactly. Yeah.
different. But the question is, throughout history, there have been different battles, right? There have been different attempts to remedy these paradoxes. There have been rise and falls of civilizations. And I think that the more intellectually lazy people just say, yeah, it's just rise and fall. It's just a cycle, as if nothing has changed since, 2000 years ago. But the reality is, the battle to develop creativity in an increasing proportion of the population, or to increasingly higher levels, right? Everybody has creativity, but if we talk about talent, this idea of like lost talent, or talent, great talent that was squandered, right? Or great potential, lost potential. So these are real things. And I think when we're
Yeah.
talking about something like Prometheus and the nature of creativity, we're really talking about how do you develop this quality in more people. And it's not watching Netflix. It's not by watching Netflix. It's not by watching Amazon.
No.
That's not what we're talking about. That's why we're talking about high art. It's the
Yeah.
it's that other that allows us to actually develop these things in in a more intelligible way, in a way that creativity becomes more of uh, a forming principle in our society. And right now, I think it's just to add, just before I'm going on here, but I mean, there's so much to say, right? It's such a rich theme. I think a lot of popular culture is destroying creativity, right? I think a lot of popular education, and even we could say history teaching, it's destroying creativity. Firstly, because it doesn't really talk about it as a thing, right? Creativity is always this obscure thing. We just talk about events, or I mean, in a lot of pop culture, right? I've seen so many interesting films, shall we call them, recently, on Amazon and Netflix. Like, there's all sorts of new stuff always coming out, but
Yeah, sure.
there's a recurring image, right? There's a recurring theme that I notice, and there's a lot of end of the world movies. There's a lot of natural disaster movies, right? There's a lot of sort of, human beings are getting
Yeah.
replaced by.
And I mean, you're right. Like, these are all wastes of time, because I mean, it's nothing new, really. Like you said, fire is bad. Zeus said fire is bad, so therefore fire is bad, and we're gonna ban it. So it's like no creativity allowed. It's out the window. And
And
you're right. Like, if
yeah,
you don't have creativity, then it's really hard to look at history and make sense of it, because human beings sometimes take crazy decisions, but it's not just crazy in itself. Like, there's reasons they take these decisions. And instead of Netflix, maybe I would recommend people would go back and read Plato's dialogues,
mm,
or read with their friends. You could have Zoom meetings and read different characters, because they're dialogues, so they are different personifications of ideas,
yeah,
or concept, viewpoints on the world. And you're going to be surprised how a lot of people still today think like some Gorgias or Thrasymachus or Meno, or all these
right,
characters that are in Plato's dialogues.
right.
And they basically, when you get to know them and know how they think, then I think you appreciate a bit more um, the the kind of parallel you can make with our own leaders today.
Right.
And it makes sense. Human beings need to figure out, about creativity. And if not, then they revert to all kind of linguistic stratagems to try to make their own way. And yeah, it's not very good for the whole of us. Has it been?
Right. I mean, there's so many things to unpack there, and I can hear the protests, right? Because it was said that there's no creativity in Netflix, and again, Netflix is like there's millions of movies there, right? So, or same with Amazon Prime, like there's millions of different things coming out. So it could sound a bit crazy what's meant by that. But the point is that you're trying to qualify what you mean by creativity. Like,
Mm-hmm.
some people will call, there's the classic, just throwing a turd on the wall. Like, is that creativity?
Mm-hmm.
You could argue, there's people who will argue it, or those people who will feel compelled to argue it because of their ideas about, art is whatever you make it. So if you believe that, even if you don't like the way a turd on the wall looks, you still kind of have to defend it, because otherwise, your ideas are going to be subject to reason as well. They're going to be subject to investigation as well. And
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
so that's uncomfortable for a lot of people. But again, the idea of qualifying what you mean by creativity, I mean, when you talk about Plato and Plato's dialogues, I think that's very interesting when you're putting, like, they're acting out ideas. And
Mm-hmm.
there's great drama there. The question is, how does a Thrasymachus think? Like, what does that mean to think like Thrasymachus? What does it mean
Yeah.
to think
Mm-hmm.
like a Meno? Right. And people will maybe like, who cares, or maybe they just want to be entertained or whatever. But the point is that these things are all around you. So it's
Yeah.
not a question that these ideas are not still uh, have no bearing on our society. It's quite the opposite. It's that to the degree that people aren't really thinking about thinking, right? Thinking about what the nature of the universe is that they're living in. What is they're operating on a certain assumption about the nature of the universe. And
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, when you start to talk to a lot of people and you ask a couple of questions, I think it's very common that people, they don't really have many answers, right? Like they haven't really thought, or I shouldn't say they haven't really thought about it that much. It gets a bit annoying if you start to keep asking questions. And that's
Mm-hmm.
what Plato always used to do. And you see that the Thrasymachus and the Minos, the Zeuses, you can find them everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Exactly. Yeah.
The question is, the only way you can really defeat a bad idea is with a good idea, number one, and being able to demonstrate why something is a bad idea. But the question, regardless, is that it only happens at the level of ideas. So, Thrasymachus may be a nice guy, maybe we'll watch Netflix together, have a drink, whatever, you know, but that's
Yeah.
the,
Well, as you said, this is art to a high level because you can partake into it, and it's a social thing. It's not just something that you do in a ivory tower, away from society. It's not that's not necessarily how you're gonna make the best, your discoveries. I would say you never make the discoveries like that, but it's really with struggling with these concepts and bouncing them with other people that you realize that oh, okay, this is how people think, and maybe there's a problem there, or maybe I have a problem thinking the way I think, and
right.
then you figure out stuff. But it's like it's what Plato does with his dialogues. Yeah, you said it's drama. I would say it's also kind of poetry because really there's a high density of paradoxes, and it's maybe a different form of poetry, but it's really it's of a high order.
Yeah, its function is poetic. It may be prose, but it's prose whose function is poetic as opposed to like descriptive or
Yeah, exactly. Because it never, like you said, it never gives you the answer. A lot of people are really angered about that, and they follow the different kind of slanders that happen historically, uh, against Plato. But Plato is not something that you can just put in a box.
in a soundbite.
It's really, yeah, no, exactly. It's something that you have to struggle with because how do you know he's really telling you the truth? You know, how do you know he's really thinking what he says?
Yeah,
And then the different characters, they have different things to say. So why doesn't he just give us the answer? They were all wrong, and that's the answer. Let's do this.
right. The point is,
He never.
it's the method. You can't show it. You kind of have to act it out. You have to, you know, it's not a
Yeah,
material thing. It's not something you can point to.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so mankind, through history, we've had different experiments with these ideas. And to go back to the question
Hmm.
of,
Okay, I like that.
the sorry?
I said I like that. The idea that we've had different experiments, like we're experimenting
Oh.
with,
Mhm.
we're human species. So obviously there's similarities between, let's say, what happened with Solon, you know,
Mhm.
700 BC, and
Yeah.
things we can see today. And the sort of lazy intellectual is just going to say, well, it's all just cycles, as if nothing has happened since, the American Revolution, or anything, right? Or the Renaissance, right? The Golden Renaissance, or
Mhm.
a lot of other developments, right? They're comfortable saying they're cycles, then they don't really have to think about it. Or like you're saying, this idea of an experiment, like these things, there's different ideas being tested out here.
Yeah. And the next character I wanted to bring into that story is Benjamin Franklin.
Mm,
Because more recently, if people don't want to go back to Prometheus, well, at least go back to Benjamin Franklin. It's not that far
okay.
away from us. And what did he do? Well, he was, as you know, one of the founding fathers of the American Republic. So as I was reading, the constitutional order of Solon, I was really thinking about the United States nowadays, and what kind of a crisis it's in, and what they could do maybe to get out of it.
Hmm.
And Benjamin Franklin was called the modern Prometheus.
Interesting. Right.
Yeah, he was not just like a guy who wrote funny stories. Well, he was a printer, by trade, but eventually, he became ambassador to England for the colonies, for the 13 colonies.
That's no small job. That's no small job.
Yeah, and then he went to France, and he was very influential in starting different industries in England and in France. The circles that were working around him, and he was doing a lot of experiments on the question of electricity, and it's basically where that idea comes from, the modern Prometheus, because electricity was seen as you know the fire. Uh, how do you harness this kind of fire
Yeah.
at the time?
The thing
But
comes
it's
from the sky.
yeah. But as you get to know the character of Franklin, you see that it's not just that. It's really uh, he's going to be kind of the Solon of the United States too. He's going to, I don't think that the Constitution in the end was exactly what he wanted, but as he said, when he came out of the convention, he was asked, what, Dr. Franklin, what have you brought us? And he said, well, a republic if you can keep it. That's a famous Benjamin Franklin quote.
Right.
It's also it's on the booklet of the Constitution, if I remember well.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, this touches on an important question right now, because there's a quote as well, because it's a republic if you can keep it, which,
Hmm.
I mean, that's pretty significant here, because everybody's always talking about what's the right system, what's the right way. But here there's an idea that, well, there is no perfect system, right? There needs to be a certain level of development within the population in terms of their ability to wrestle with ideas, right? To do what basically Plato does in his dialogues. If you can engage in a Platonic dialogue where ideas there are thought experiments, right? Somebody presents an idea, or we should do this. And well, the question is, well, what does the universe look like based on your idea? Like why not act this out rather than just saying we should do XYZ? Like, does the world really work with your idea, or does it just sound nice? And there's a quote, I don't have it, but it's by James Fenimore Cooper, and it's called, I believe, The American Democrat. And he just makes the point that the greatest danger in a democracy is the fact that opinion can be manipulated, right? Because people are free to think what they want. They're free to discuss what they want, to watch what they want. So any enemy of freedom, any sort of Zeus, which will not be able to just sort of impose its will, right, by brute force, by boots on the ground, that will not work against a republic. People will just rise up, right? There's going to be a sort of, it's not going to work. For the empire sort of figured that out. And again, it was a great sort of change in the quote unquote cycles of history, in that, physical imperial rule sort of went out of, I mean, people could argue it's still popular, but in a sense, people have a freedom. You can't just break into people's houses in a lot of places. At least you still can in some. But ultimately, all that to say, here's the rub. It's with ideas. That's how if you want to destroy a nation, a sovereign nation today, a republic, right? You don't do it through military force in most cases. You do it through subversion. You do it through ideological warfare. And I mean, in the time of Plato, this is really what he was dealing with the sophists, who were these foreigners, most of the time, coming in with all sort of, all smooth talkers, a lot of nice rhetoric, right? There's a whole school of rhetoric, and they all talk really nice. But when Socrates sort of tries to actually ascertain what their ideas are and gets them to sort of defend their ideas and to put their ideas into practice through thought experiments and sort of dramatizing, right?
Ideas, yeah, you push it to the extreme. You go, okay, so if you say this, then that, then this and that, and so how does it end up? Yeah,
we find out that these ideas don't really work. They're no good. They're crap. They just sounded nice. But one has to be able to think at a level where they're ready and willing and excited to investigate the nature of an idea. And this gets back to what we said at the beginning. Just because something doesn't have any directly perceivable characteristics, it doesn't mean it doesn't have any indirectly perceivable characteristics. There's a way to investigate ideas. And this is the thing, if people's opinions can be swayed through all sorts of different media, right, through promotion of different kinds of cultures, right, you could, subversion could take many forms, right? The British Empire was flooding China with opium, right? Keeping a lot of its population, sort of leaving it wasting away and just collecting all the drug money. And you have this today, right? You have a drug culture. You have, I mean, the most useful way to probably think about it is Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, right? Where there is no tragedy, there's no Shakespeare, that's not allowed. He specifically states that it's not for people in that world. And he's told, when the guy asks, well, why can't we have this beautiful language, which really gets to such a deep level, he says, well, because there's no tragedy in this world. And in high art, in Shakespeare, he calls it high art, he says there's tragedy. So there's the rub. Okay, in the Brave New World, in this utopia, in a sense, this dystopic utopia, there's no tragedy, there's no bad, but there's no good, there's no joy, there's no grief. It's just this homogeneous blah. And if anything ever sort of, if there are any cracks in the system, cracks in anything, well, there's soma, right? There's drugs for people to be sedated. And there's not only drugs, there's synthetic music, there's dance, there's and there's sex. So you have the trifecta. And the whole point, though, is this is demonstrated as a way to control the population. So I think this gets back to, as well, what we were saying about the destruction of creativity in popular culture. People are getting a heavy dose of drug, sex, and synthetic music. And, unless we take it to the level of ideas, there's no way to really sort of judge any of these things or to like investigate what their nature is. Like, okay, people are having fun. What's the big deal? You know, no harm, no foul, as they say.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting that you mentioned that, and you say it's music. Maybe it's I would call it more repetitive beats, but yeah, I get what you mean. It makes me think of Plato's Republic. In the book 8, because you said like you could have uh, the idea or the system of Zeus, or the system of the oligarchical system. Um, this way of thinking can actually be present in a democracy.
Right.
It can be present in a tyranny when it's only one leader. It could be present in an oligarchy when it's a gang controlling the system.
Mm.
Or he talks about democracy also when I think it's the military. Well, and it goes on and on. It could be like an endless cycle, but that's not what Plato, wants us to end with. But he says these are all perversions of an idea. And so what is the idea? How should we reconcile all of these different systems? You could say, political systems,
Right.
but that in the end they are designed to organize society. So how do we want to organize society? What kind of principle is lacking in the perversions that he sees in democracy, in the endless cycle of democracy, tyranny, oligarchy, democracy, and on and on. Like what's lacking there? What's the problem? And so I think that fits well with the idea of what Prometheus did by giving fire and what it means to people today. Because as you said, they could have drugs, sex, entertainment, uh, all for their consumption today. It's go at it.
Right. And it
It's
makes
all there.
it can make fire a lot less appealing, like you could go through this great journey and battle for fire, and there's people that are going to want to stop you, and they're going to create all sorts of problems for you. Zeus and his gang, or you could
Yeah.
just sort of lay back and enjoy and live your best life, as they say. So
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that a lot of people, even though probably they would dispute it, over what we said about the drugs, for example, because it's a very popular idea today. The legalization of
sure.
drugs or decriminalization at least. Um, and like of course, probably this, the way things are being dealt with is not necessarily the best way, but the idea is, um, is destroying your mind or giving up on creativity on fire. Is that really a solution?
Yeah. And I mean, I think as in great art, the whole question here is that it's what's not said. Okay, you have
Mm-hmm.
we have the entertainment, we have the enjoyment, we have all that. I mean, it seems preferable to, all the problems that Zeus is going to give us if we want to really have fire on, or maybe you'll have fire, but the question is, are you going to give knowledge of fire to other people, right? Are many people going to have knowledge of fire, or is it just going to be for a small class? Maybe some people think that's good, right? Maybe only some people could have fire, and give other people, a derivative of fire, something that makes them think they have fire. Who knows? Something that makes them think they're happy, right? Something that makes them think they're educated, whether it's a degree or whatever, whether it's drugs that make them think they're happy. There's a million different ways to do it. But the whole point, we're not talking about any one policy here. We're not talking about whether drugs are good or bad, whether,
No.
Hillbilly Elegy, the movie on Amazon Prime is good or bad, or whether The Purge is good or bad. We're saying the only way to really discuss these things is to get at the question of ideas, is to get at the level of ideas, because there's a million different things going on. So, but ultimately, our society, the organization of a society, is the reflection of an idea, as you said. And unless people are willing to step up to that level of idea, there's no way you're going to be able to deal with all these single issues, right? And all these individual questions that people have, because we're forgetting the biggest question, which is, what is the nature of the human species? Are we a Promethean species? Or are we, or are we meant to be beasts under a Zeusian system? There's many different ways to look at this. So the question is, people have to be able to ask those questions, right? And investigate those ideas and what they could look like, what they look like.
That's right. Yeah, and I think you made a good point where, at the beginning you said, like, sorry, I'm trying to collect my ideas right now. You said that good ideas were the only solutions to bad ideas.
Right.
That's how you solve bad ideas, is with good ideas.
Right.
And I think that's clearly the approach that, the Prometheus story tells us, and what Plato also tells us, how to actually generate these good ideas by confronting all of these bad ideas and trying to filter them out. And I mean, today, I think it's a great, like I said before, it's a great endeavor to actually look at Benjamin Franklin and see a modern version of Prometheus. And in the end, like, to kind of touch, come back to the question, the boxes, the oppositions, capitalism, communism, which system is the best? Where would Prometheus, which,
Right. Yeah.
which box would he put his check in?
Is Prometheus
Well, I think,
a Marxist or a capitalist, right? That's what the person,
well, I think that question actually goes better with Zeus. I think the Zeusian system, there you can put some fixed system, and it's appropriate. But I think that Prometheus and fire, it's not in any boxes.
Yeah.
It just flies way over.
Right. Yeah.
And that's how I would answer that question.
No, I think it's great. I think it's great. The question is, do we want to have, what does it mean to be a Promethean species, right? What does it mean to have a Promethean outlook, right? What is a Zeusian outlook? And just to say that if we look at our modern society, we can still see these two different outlooks at war. And if we consider that, and if we consider what the Zeusian system, whatever form it's taking today, and consider what the Promethean system is, or what it can be, I mean, that's a great, I think, challenge for people in terms of, like, what system are you really supporting? We're not talking about capitalists or Marxists or Democrat or Republicans. Let's ask a different question. Are you a Promethean or are you a Zeusian? What does that mean? That's arguably, I mean, this is high art. This is a question that one of the greatest tragedians would probably ask each one of us, get us to consider. And I think that sort of throws the whole chessboard over when you think of how education today is sort of organized, and they want to reduce things to all these nice labels and categories. Sorry, Prometheus doesn't fit into that. And that's why it's such a great work. It's so timeless, because it's saying something that's really, that transcends all these other, sort of individual, I don't know what you want to call them, all these different opinions, shall we call them, maybe?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. System of thoughts. Yeah, that's opinions. That's fine to me. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a very good lesson for today. I
Yeah.
mean,
I
if
mean,
we were to
I think we're
go
gonna,
back and read Prometheus Bound. Yeah.
yeah. And I think we're gonna leave our listeners on that. We're just gonna let that sort of hang there. And I think that's probably a good way to end.
Hmm. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you very much, Dave.
Well, thank you, Pascal, for joining us. And yeah, I look forward to you joining us again. So thank you, everybody, for listening, and we'll be back next week.